The first warning signs appeared like distant storm clouds on an otherwise clear horizon. I should have recognized them sooner, but love has a way of blinding even the most perceptive eyes. Tom's late-night phone calls, hushed and urgent, always ended abruptly when I entered the room. His excuses about work meetings grew more elaborate, while our joint bank account steadily dwindled. I remember the exact moment when doubt first crept into our marriage like a poisonous vine. It was during dinner with our closest friends, Mark and Sarah, at the new steakhouse downtown. Tom's phone kept buzzing, not unusual for a financial advisor, except this was Saturday night. His hands trembled slightly as he declined each call, leaving them unanswered while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the restaurant's aggressive air conditioning. "Everything okay, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I watched him check his phone for the 10th time that evening. "Just some clients panicking about the market," he replied with that reassuring smile that had won me over 7 years ago. But something in his eyes had changed, a flicker of desperation that sent chills down my spine. Sarah caught my eye across the table, her expression mirroring my growing unease. She'd known me since college, long before I met Tom, and could read me like an open book. The slight shake of her head told me she sensed it too, something was terribly wrong. The signs multiplied like fractures in thin ice. Credit card bills arrived with unusual charges at odd hours. Our savings account, once healthy and growing, began showing mysterious withdrawals. Tom explained them away with practiced ease: investment opportunities, work expenses, client entertainment. But the numbers didn't add up, and neither did his increasingly erratic behavior. I started tracking the withdrawals in secret, documenting each unexplained transaction in a password-protected spreadsheet. The pattern was clear: large sums disappearing late at night or early morning, often followed by even larger deposits that temporarily masked the bleeding of our financial security. The deposits grew smaller while the withdrawals remained steady, like a mathematical countdown to disaster. One night, I lay awake listening to Tom's whispered conversation in his home office. His voice carried an edge of panic I'd never heard before. "I can double it by next week," he promised someone. "I've got a system now. It's foolproof." The words sent ice through my veins. I'd heard similar promises from my father years ago, before his gambling addiction tore our family apart. The next morning, I confronted Tom over breakfast, my hands wrapped around a coffee mug to hide their trembling. "Is there something you need to tell me about our finances?" I asked, watching his face carefully. His reaction confirmed my worst fears. The color drained from his face before he forced a laugh that sounded hollow and brittle. "Everything's fine, Jen. You worry too much, it's all under control." But I'd seen that look before, in my father's eyes 2 decades ago. The same desperate optimism, the same conviction that the next bet would solve everything. History was repeating itself in my own home, and I was watching it happen in slow motion. That night, I called Sarah and asked her to meet me for coffee the next day. As I hung up the phone, Tom's laptop pinged with an email notification. The subject line glowed in the darkness of our bedroom: "Final notice, payment required." My finger hovered over the mouse pad, my heart pounding in my chest. One click would confirm what I already knew in my gut. One click would shatter the last remnants of trust in our marriage. The laptop screen illuminated Tom's side of the bed, empty now as he worked late again. Or at least, that's what he claimed. The cursor blinked at me like a challenge, daring me to uncover the truth that would change everything. With a deep breath, I clicked. The email opened like a door to the abyss, each line of text another step into darkness. My hands grew cold as I scrolled through message after message, each one revealing the elaborate architecture of Tom's deception. They weren't just gambling debts, they were a mountain of lies that threatened to avalanche down upon our entire life together. The next morning, I met Sarah at our usual coffee shop, the cheerful morning buzz a stark contrast to the leaden weight in my chest. She listened without interruption as I laid out the evidence: the late-night calls, the disappearing money, and finally, the emails that confirmed every suspicion. "He's mortgaged our house," I whispered, the words burning like acid in my throat. "Without telling me. Without my signature. He forged it, Sarah. He forged my name." The reality of his betrayal crystallized in that moment, sharp and cutting as broken glass. Sarah's face darkened with rage, but her voice remained steady. "Have you confronted him yet?" "I'm waiting for the right moment," I replied, though in truth, I was gathering my strength for the battle ahead. Every hour since discovering those emails had been spent planning, calculating, preparing for the confrontation that would either save or destroy my marriage. That moment came sooner than expected. I returned home to find Tom in his office, hunched over his laptop with the desperate intensity of a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor made him jump, guilty consciousness written across his face in bold strokes. "We need to talk about the mortgage, Tom." My voice emerged stronger than I expected, carrying years of accumulated strength I hadn't known I possessed. "About the forged signature. About all of it." He tried to deflect, to redirect, to minimize, tactics I recognized from years of watching my father's addiction play out. But I held firm, laying out document after document, proof after proof, until his excuses crumbled into dust. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his face contorting with a desperation that would have moved me once. "I had a system. I still have a system. I can fix this, Jen. I just need a little more time." Time. The word tasted bitter. Time to lose everything we've built. Time to drag us both into bankruptcy. Each question landed like a blow, stripping away the veneer of our perfect life to reveal the rot beneath. "I'm good for it," he insisted, pulling up spreadsheets filled with complex calculations and projected wins. "Look at these numbers. One good run and we're back on top. Better than ever." I laughed then, a sound so hollow it scared me. "Numbers don't lie, Tom, but you do. You've been lying for months. Years, maybe. And now you've committed fraud in my name." His face changed then, anger replacing desperation. "You're overreacting. This is my job, I understand finance better than you ever could. You're just like your mother, always panicking, always trying to control everything." The comparison struck deep, but not in the way he intended. My mother had stayed, had watched helplessly as my father's addiction destroyed our family piece by piece. History would not repeat itself, not in my story. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I am like my mother. I recognize the signs. But I won't make her mistakes." I turned to leave his office, but his next words stopped me cold. "If you walk away now, you'll regret it. I've got everything under control. Just trust me one more time." Trust. The word hung in the air between us like smoke from a burning bridge. I thought of the mortgage documents bearing my forged signature, of our dwindling savings, of the countless nights I'd lain awake listening to his whispered phone calls. Trust wasn't just broken, it was shattered beyond recognition. Standing in the doorway, I felt a curious sense of calm descend over me. "You're right, Tom. I will regret this moment." I turned to face him one last time. "But not for the reasons you think." As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. The subject line made my blood run cold: "Foreclosure notice, immediate action required." In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about saving my marriage anymore. It was about saving myself. The days following our confrontation stretched like a wilderness of broken glass, each step requiring careful navigation through the shards of our shattered life. I watched Tom spiral deeper into his web of delusion, his promises of recovery ringing hollow against the granite wall of reality I'd begun to build around my heart. Sarah's guest room became my sanctuary, a space where I could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of Tom's desperation pressing against my chest. Each night, I lay awake dissecting the anatomy of our collapse, tracing the fault lines that had been there from the beginning. The signs I'd ignored blazed now like neon confessions in the darkness of hindsight. "You're different," Sarah observed one evening, studying my face over a glass of wine. "Stronger." Her words caught me off guard, forcing me to examine my reflection in the window. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who had discovered those emails just weeks ago. She wore vulnerability like armor now, each crack and fissure reinforced with steel. I thought of my mother then, remembering how she would sit at our kitchen table late at night, drowning in unpaid bills and broken promises. "Never again," I whispered to my reflection, watching as determination hardened my features into something unfamiliar yet necessary. The transformation wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. Each day, I moved through our shared life like a chess player, calculating moves and countermoves. I documented every transaction, every lie, every desperate attempt Tom made to claw back control. The spreadsheet of our destruction became my battle plan, each entry a bullet point in the strategy of survival I was crafting. Mark, ever the loyal friend, connected me with Patricia Chen, a divorce attorney known for handling cases involving addiction and financial fraud. Her office felt like a war room, its walls lined with degrees that gleamed like weapons. "The mortgage fraud changes everything," Patricia explained, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years' experience. "But we need to move carefully. Men like your husband, they're most dangerous when they feel cornered." I recognized the truth in her words, remembering the flash of something primal in Tom's eyes during our confrontation. The man I'd married was disappearing, replaced by someone driven by desperation and denial. Yet even as I planned my escape, part of me ached to save him. That evening, I returned to our house to collect more documents. Tom was there, surrounded by betting slips and printouts of gambling strategies. The sight of him, disheveled, unshaven, eyes wild with the fever of addiction, sent a shock through my system. "I've figured it out," he announced, gesturing to his papers with trembling hands. "A perfect system. 2 weeks, Jen. Give me 2 weeks and I'll win it all back. Everything we lost, plus more." The rawness of his delusion cut deeper than any betrayal. I saw in him my father's ghost, heard in his voice the same desperate optimism that had haunted my childhood. But this time, I wasn't a helpless witness to the destruction. "I've opened a separate account," I told him, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "I'm transferring my salary there. You need help, Tom, professional help. I'll support your recovery, but I won't fund your addiction." His face contorted, cycling through confusion, anger, and finally, a calculated manipulation that chilled me to the bone. "After everything we've been through? Everything I've done for you?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "What about your father, Jen? Remember how you swore you'd never abandon someone like your mother did?" The words were perfectly aimed arrows, designed to pierce my deepest vulnerabilities. But they found armor instead of flesh. I thought of my mother again, but this time, I saw her differently, not as someone who had abandoned, but as someone who should have left sooner. "My father destroyed himself," I replied, each word a brick in the wall between us. "I won't let you destroy me too." Later that night, as I sorted through financial documents in Sarah's guest room, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Harrison, your husband owes us $50,000. Time's running out. Would be a shame if something happened to your pretty house. Or worse." The threat hung in the digital space between us, a dark promise that transformed my careful chess game into a race against time. I stared at the message until the screen went dark, feeling the last threads of hesitation burn away in the acid bath of reality. This wasn't just about saving myself anymore, it was about survival in its most primal form. As I reached for my phone to call Patricia, I realized that the woman I had been, trusting, forgiving, desperate to help, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the ice of necessity. The chessmen were set. The time for careful moves was over. The threats arrived like vultures circling ever closer, each message carrying the stench of violence barely contained within digital characters. 3 more texts from different numbers, each more explicit than the last. The final one included a photo of me leaving Patricia's office, the timestamp from just hours ago. They were watching, waiting, measuring the precise coordinates of my movements like predators studying prey. But I was no longer prey. In Patricia's office the next morning, the gravity of our situation crystallized into diamond-hard clarity. The bank statement spread before us told a story more horrifying than I'd imagined. Tom hadn't just mortgaged our house, he'd systematically liquidated every asset we owned, converting our financial stability into casino chips and online betting accounts. "He's in deeper than we thought," Patricia said, her manicured finger tracing a pattern of transactions that read like a suicide note for our marriage. "These aren't just casual bets. He's involved with serious players." The words settled in my stomach like lead shots. I thought of the photograph they'd sent, the implicit violence in their digital surveillance. "How much time do we have?" "Days, maybe hours before they move against your assets." Patricia's eyes met mine, carrying the weight of experience. "But there's something else. These transaction patterns, they suggest Tom might be more than just a gambling addict." She pulled out another document, this one showing a complex web of transfers between accounts I'd never known existed. "He's been moving money for them, Jennifer. Large sums. The gambling might be real, but it could also be a cover for something darker." The revelation detonated in my chest like a buried mine, sending shrapnel through every memory, every moment of our shared life. Had everything been a lie? Every kiss, every promise, every shared dream, were they all just pieces of an elaborate con? Back at Sarah's house, I sat in the darkened guest room, letting the truth settle into my bones like a new skeleton. The woman I'd been 3 months ago would have crumbled under this weight. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming the thing you feared most. My phone buzzed, another unknown number. But this time, it was different. A voice I recognized from years ago, though I tried to forget it. "Hello, Jennifer." My father's voice, rough with age and regret, scraped against my ear. "I heard about Tom." "About what's happening?" The irony tasted like ashes in my mouth. "How did you find me?" "I've been involved in that world for a long time. Still am, in ways." A pause heavy with unspoken history. "These people Tom's mixed up with, they're not just bookies. They use gambling addiction to recruit money launderers. I should know. I was one of them." Each word was a key unlocking doors in my memory I'd kept sealed for decades. Suddenly, my father's disappearances, the mysterious cash infusions that would temporarily save us, the men who would visit late at night, it all aligned into a pattern I'd been too young to recognize. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to understand what you're dealing with." And another pause, this one filled with something that might have been shame. "Because I can help. I know their methods, their weaknesses. Let me do this one thing for you." The offer hung in the air like smoke, tempting and toxic. I thought of my mother, of her choices, of the moral compromises that had eaten away at her soul. Then I thought of the photograph they'd sent, of the implicit threat in their digital surveillance. "What exactly are you offering?" "Information. Evidence. Enough to take them down, and Tom with them, if that's what you want." He spoke faster now, urgency threading through his words. "But we have to move fast. They're not just watching you. They're grooming Tom to take over a bigger operation. Once that happens..." A knock at the door cut through our conversation like a knife. Through the window, I saw 2 men in dark suits standing on Sarah's porch, their postures radiating controlled menace. My father must have heard something in my silence. "Are they there?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't let them see you. Don't let them in. I'm sending you an address." Meet me there in 2 hours. And Jennifer? Delete this number. The line went dead as another knock echoed through the house, harder this time. More demanding. Sarah appeared in the hallway, her face pale with question. Through the decorative glass panels flanking her front door, I could see the men's silhouettes like dark sentinels, waiting. My phone vibrated once, a text with an address in the industrial district. In that moment, standing in the shadowed hallway of my best friend's house, I faced a choice that would define not just my future, but the very essence of who I was becoming. I could run, hide, play by the rules and hope the legal system would protect me. Or I could step into the darkness I'd spent my entire life avoiding, armed with the very knowledge I'd been running from. The knock came a third time, and with it, my decision crystallized. I'd wanted justice, but maybe what I really needed was revenge. The industrial district stretched before me like an urban grave, its abandoned warehouses standing sentinel over secrets as dark as my own emerging purpose. My father waited in the shadow of a defunct textile mill, time etching deeper lines into his face than I remembered. The years between us felt like centuries of accumulated pain, yet in that moment, we were bound by something darker than blood, the shared knowledge of what desperate men could do. "You look like your mother," he said, the words carrying a weight of regret that could sink battleships. "But you move differently. Stronger. Smarter." His eyes, mirror images of my own, held a calculated appreciation that made my skin crawl even as I recognized its necessity. The evidence he provided came in a simple thumb drive, innocuous as a bullet before it's fired. "Everything's here, transaction records, communications, the entire network. Tom's just a small piece of their operation, but he's their weakness. Their vulnerability." He paused, something like pride flickering across his weathered features. "Just like you were mine." The admission scraped against old wounds, but I felt nothing. The woman who would have flinched at such pain had been cremated in the fire of Tom's betrayal. What rose from those ashes was someone who understood that old wounds could become new weapons. Back at Sarah's house, I immersed myself in the digital testament of Tom's descent. Each file was a chapter in a story of systematic destruction, not just of our marriage, but of everything I'd believed about love, trust, and redemption. The network my father had exposed was vast, a hydra of financial crimes using gambling addiction as both lure and leash. Patricia's reaction to the evidence was controlled fury wrapped in professional precision. "This changes everything," she said, her fingers dancing across her keyboard as she took notes. "But Jennifer, you need to understand, using this information comes with risks. Legal risks. Personal risks." I laughed then, a sound devoid of humor. "Risks? They're already watching my every move. They've threatened everything I have left. What more can they take?" "Your freedom," she answered simply. "Your future. Your soul." The words should have struck fear into my heart. Instead, they crystallized my resolve. I thought of Tom, probably sitting in our house even now, drowning in delusions of redemption while darker forces moved through him like a current through a wire. I thought of my mother, who had chosen safety over justice and paid for that choice with decades of quiet desperation. I would choose differently. The plan came together like a symphony of vengeance, each element precisely timed and carefully orchestrated. My father's evidence provided the ammunition, but the strategy was mine, a calculated dance of legal maneuvers and strategic revelations that would dismantle their operation one pressure point at a time. "You're not just going after Tom anymore," Patricia warned, reviewing my proposed course of action. "This is bigger than divorce or asset protection. You're taking on an entire criminal enterprise." "No," I corrected her, my voice carrying an edge that surprised us both. "I'm taking back control. Of everything." The first move was subtle, a carefully worded email to specific regulatory bodies, attaching select pieces of evidence that would trigger automatic investigations. The second was more direct, documentation sent to Tom's legitimate clients, revealing just enough to start a stampede of withdrawals that would disrupt the organization's money flow. Each action was a domino placed with surgical precision, designed to fall in sequence until the entire structure collapsed. But the true masterstroke came in what I held back: insurance against the inevitable retaliation I knew would come. Sarah watched my transformation with a mixture of awe and concern. "I barely recognize you anymore," she said one evening, her voice soft with worry. "You're like a completely different person." I studied my reflection in her window, seeing what she saw: the harder set of my jaw, the calculating gleam in my eyes, the way I now moved through space like a predator rather than prey. "I'm not a different person," I replied, watching my lips form words that tasted of truth and ashes. "I'm who I always was, just stripped of illusions." That night, as I finalized the last details of my plan, a text arrived from Tom: "Please come home. I need to tell you everything. No more lies." The timestamp showed 3 a.m., the desperate hours when truth sometimes slips through addiction's defenses. I stared at the message, feeling the last remnants of our shared past tremble like autumn leaves before a storm. The woman I had been would have rushed to him, eager to believe in redemption's possibility. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes salvation requires destruction. My response was simple: tomorrow. 2 p.m. Each letter was a bullet loaded into the chamber of fate's gun. The time had come to pull the trigger. As I prepared for bed, another text arrived, this one from an unknown number: "You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Harrison. Some games have no winners." The threat was clear, but it washed over me like rain on stone. They still thought they were dealing with the woman they'd first marked as a victim. Their mistake would be their undoing. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness embrace me like an old friend. Tomorrow would bring either victory or annihilation. In the space between those possibilities, I found a peace I hadn't known existed, the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. Our house stood before me like a mausoleum of broken promises, its familiar lines now strange and threatening in the harsh afternoon light. 2 o'clock approached with the inexorable weight of destiny, each tick of my watch marking another heartbeat in the countdown to confrontation. I'd arrived early, parking down the street to watch the players take their positions, dark sedans with tinted windows materializing like sharks scenting blood in the water. They were waiting for me, these men who thought they understood power, who believed they had written the rules of this game. They didn't realize I'd learned to play a different game entirely, one where the stakes weren't measured in dollars but in the currency of truth and retribution. Tom opened the door before I could knock, his appearance a shock despite my mental preparation. The confident financial advisor I'd married had vanished, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who wore desperation like a second skin. Behind him, I glimpsed suited figures in our living room, vultures come to roost in the corpse of our marriage. "Thank God you're here," he whispered, reaching for my hand. I let him take it, feeling nothing but the cold calculation of necessary contact. "We can fix this. Together. I've worked it all out." The living room had become a war room, our family photos still hanging on the walls like bitter reminders of everything that had been lost. 3 men sat arranged with calculated casualness, expensive suits and dead eyes, power-dressed in business casual. Their leader, a silver-haired man with a shark smile, stood to greet me. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Michael Crawford. We've been hoping to have this conversation for some time." I took his hand, noting the manicured nails and calloused trigger finger. A banker's hands with a killer's calluses. "I'm sure you have." The next hour unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of deception. They laid out their proposition with practiced precision, a way to save our marriage, protect our assets, ensure our future. All I had to do was sign some papers, transfer some accounts, become complicit in their web of financial manipulation. Tom watched with desperate hope as they spun their web, believing salvation lay in surrendering to the very forces that had destroyed him. "It's really quite simple," Crawford explained, sliding documents across our coffee table, the same table where Tom and I had once planned our future. You have certain skills we find valuable. Your position at the bank, your clean record. Together, we could build something extraordinary. I let them talk, let them believe they were reeling me in. Each word they spoke was being recorded, each promise of criminal conspiracy captured and transmitted to waiting ears. Patricia's team of lawyers, the FBI task force my father had connected us with, the regulatory investigators, all listening, all gathering evidence that would become bullets in the gun I had spent weeks loading. And what about Tom's gambling? I asked, watching Crawford's smile flicker at the directness of the question. A necessary cover, he admitted with practiced sympathy. An explanation for the money movements. Your husband has been instrumental in our operation, Mrs. Harrison. With your help, we could expand significantly. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. I looked at Tom, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, not just a gambling addict, but a willing participant in something far darker. The realization should have hurt, but I was beyond pain now. I had transcended it, transformed it into purpose. Before I sign anything, I said, reaching for my phone, I'd like to share something with you. The email I had prepared sat waiting, my finger hovering over the send button. A comprehensive record of your entire operation, transactions, communications, names, dates. Everything. Currently being held by multiple law firms and journalists, set to release automatically unless I prevent it every 24 hours. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Crawford's smile vanished like smoke in wind. That would be extremely unwise, Mrs. Harrison. No, I corrected him, standing to assert dominance over the space that had once been my home. What's unwise is threatening a woman who has nothing left to lose. What's unwise is believing that fear of dying could be worse than living with betrayal. The next few minutes exploded in a cascade of precisely timed events. FBI agents materialized from the shadows of my garden. Patricia's legal team arrived with court orders and restraining documents. Tom's face crumpled in realization and terror as his house of cards collapsed around him. But it was Crawford's expression I savored, the exact moment when he realized he had underestimated me, had mistaken my calculated patience for weakness. In his eyes, I saw the reflection of what I had become, someone capable of orchestrating not just revenge, but justice. Hours later, after the arrests and the statements and the beginning of what would be a long legal process, I stood in our emptied house alone. The silence felt like a benediction, a blessing over the ashes of my former life. Sarah had offered her guest room indefinitely, but I had other plans. The settlement from the case would be substantial, the rewards for exposing financial criminals generous. I pulled out my phone one last time, sending a text to my father, "Thank you for everything." His reply came quickly, "You did this yourself." I just opened the door. Looking around at the space that had witnessed both love's promise and betrayal's poison, I felt no regret, no lingering attachment. The woman who had lived here, who had loved Tom, who had believed in second chances, she was gone, transformed in the crucible of necessary vengeance. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who understood that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from the ruins of what was once called home. As I locked the door for the final time, I smiled, knowing that my story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. And this time, I would write every chapter on my own terms.